Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Oh, right. They usually do that.
Well, oh, you know who I saw recently? Elizabeth Davis. She said she was, she said she was doing some Patriarca.
She and they're a team. They were both at the University of Chicago together.
Oh, Christy?
No, her partner works with James Creasel, as a matter of fact, at Villanova.
Oh.
Sarah something. She's married to that journalist Colonial, writes about Catholic stuff.
What about, is Mary Miliozzi? Is she in Villanova too?
You know, I think she's got a
You know who kind of crossed my radar screen recently was, oh shoot, I just forgot her name. She was in the PhD in that program, Abby Alcott.
Oh yeah, what happened there?
Well, she's Southern University in the East Coast, and she was part of a video that I watched for training, for tutoring. So she's in education. She's in education.
So, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. It's great to see so many people here with us in the room, and I'm sure there are many more on YouTube. So I wanted to be sure to introduce myself. I'm Charles Levitt. I'm an Associate Director of the Center for Italian Studies and Associate Professor of Italian and Film here at the University of Notre Dame. And I wanted to welcome you all to the Italian Research Seminar, which is a core event of the Center for Italian Studies. It aims to provide a regular forum for faculty, postdoctoral scholars, graduate students, and colleagues from other universities to present and discuss their current research. And we really stress that current research, that it's work in progress. We get to see work as it's developing and I hope play a part in that development through our discussion. So the Italian Research Seminar is vigorously interdisciplinary and embraces all areas of Italian literature, language, and culture, as well as perceptions of Italy, its achievements, and its peoples in other national and international cultures. And it constitutes an important element in the effort by Notre Dame's Center for Italian Studies to promote the study of Italy and to serve as a strategic point of contact for scholarly exchange. So I'm glad that you're all here with us for a scholarly exchange. And a scholarly exchange with our illustrious guest, who is Silvana Patriarca, Professor of History at Fordham University. Professor Patriarca specializes in the socio-cultural history of modern Italy from the Risorgimento to the present, with a particular focus on the history of nationalism and racism in connection with the construction of Italian and more generally European national identities. Her most recent book, Il colore della Repubblica, published in English with Cambridge University Press as Race in Post-Fascist Italy, explores the persistence of ideas of race and the collapse of fascism and their impact on the representation and life experience of the children born in the encounter between Italian women and black Allied soldiers at the end of the Second World War. Professor Patriarca is also the author of Italian Vices, Nation and Character from the Risorgimento to the Republic, from Cambridge University Press in 2010, and Numbers and Nationhood, Writing Statistics in 19th Century Italy, also from Cambridge University Press in 1996. And she's the co-editor of the volume Risorgimento Revisited, Nationalism and Culture in 19th Century Italy from Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. Her lecture for today is entitled Anticolonialisms as Antiracisms, Italian Radicals Facing Race and the Colonial Question at the Turn of the 20th Century. So please join me in welcoming to Notre Dame Professor Silvana Patriarca.
Thank you very much, Charles, for the introduction, and thanks to the Center for Italian Studies and the other promoters of this lecture, and for the invitation to speak here. So I'm very glad to be able to share with you some ideas for a research project which is still at an initial stage. So I will appreciate your questions, your criticism, your suggestions. So the project is that of writing a history of anti-racism in the plural in Italy. It's tentatively titled Cultures of Anti-Racism. And my interest in this topic comes from my book on the mixed-race children of the Second World War, where I first approached the issue of anti-racism in connection with the stories of the treatment and the representation of these children. So the book is primarily focused on their racializations as black and inferior, and not really as members of the Italian nation. They're sort of seen by many like little aliens. But the book deals also in part with the attempts of some people to make them feel part of Italy, right? So it's not everybody in Italy at the time share prejudices, and some in fact rejected the racism that they saw against these children on the basis of the idea of equality of all humans. So there was a kind of universalist anti-racism at the time. And then I noticed also how in the 1960s, anti-racist sensibilities grew, and they were openly expressed in connection with the civil rights movement in the US, Black Power. So progressive left-wing Italians grew interested at the time in these movements and also in black culture, in black music, and so they follow these movements. So the writings also of black intellectuals and activists were immediately translated at the time at a vast reception on the left. So you can see some of these books at the time. And so also left-wing directors made films documenting the anti-colonial struggle to express their identification with the black struggle and their solidarity. Not so much, let's say, it was not so much on the Italian colonial past, but there was a lot of sympathy for anti-colonial movements and anti-racist movements elsewhere. But that was not the only time where you can see the objection to anti-black racism, the rejection of this type of racism. The interwar period also should be taken into consideration, and some people, as in fact some scholars have explored a bit the connection between anti-racism and anti-fascism at the time in the anti-colonial battle around the occupation of Ethiopia. So when there was let's say, an attempt to bring together these various ideas. Right after the war, as also Charles has shown in an article, this sensibility led to an interest in the works of African American intellectuals, several of whose works were translated also into Italian. But but the question is, when does the history of anti-racism in Italy begin? I mean, how far back can we trace it? I'm not referring here to the resistance, and in general, how far back can we go to sort of write also a more general history about anti-racism? So I'm not referring to the here, so to the resistance of the racialized to racial oppression, which has always existed in one form or another. So, and I'm not referring to the denunciation of racism by black and brown intellectuals, although we should also consider, of course, how that interacted also with the formation of anti-racism among whites. But so I'm here referring, when I use the term anti-racism, to the explicit critique and rejection of the notion of race and of racist ideologies and practices by white Europeans, and what I will focus in particular are white Italians. I encountered one of these white Europeans or Italians who criticized the category of race and rejected racism, at least to a point. As we will see, when writing the book on the discourse of national character. He was a Sicilian sociologist and Republican socialist politician by the name of Napoleone Colajanni. He happened to be also a strong critic of colonialism in the 1880s and 1890s. An aspect of his work which I didn't consider at that time. And also a critic, he was also a critic of anti-Southern prejudice. As we will see, there was a connection between the two types of racism, anti-black and anti-Southerner, but also between the critiques of both racism. History of anti-racism are not numerous nor well established, and some existing ones have at times been accused of being too presentist, of projecting back our sensibilities and our categories. To be sure, the term anti-racism itself is of very recent coinage. It began circulating only in the 1960s in the Anglophone world, and in the 1970s in Italy. But the fact that the word did not exist, of course, does not mean that there were no people who opposed racism, and here understood as prejudice plus discrimination, right? This combination of the idea that you can divide humanity into groups and they're very different, and you can organize them into a hierarchy, and you can discriminate against those who you consider inferior. The term racism, understood in its critical sense, began circulating only in the late 1920s in France among the critics of anti-Semitism. An anti-racist organization was established in France at the end of the 1920s, and this was the LICA. It translates as International League Against Anti-Semitism, that then started to be called also International League Against Racism and Anti-Semitism. And it acquired this name actually only in 1979, if I'm not mistaken. But its target was essentially anti-Semitism. As long as we pay attention to the historical specificity of the anti-racist critiques and movements, I think it is possible to do a history of anti-racism that is not anachronistic, that doesn't project back what we think it is. Of course, we think anti-racism or racism is different. You know, we have different ideas, and you know, we could discuss that on how to define. But let's say a working definition is the one that I gave you. So this kind of history won't be a unilinear history, and it will have to document many sort of discontinuity, contradictions, disappearances, and reappearances in various forms. In the Italian case, history of anti-racism are pretty much non-existent. If we exclude a few articles on some specific aspects of types of anti-racism at specific times. So I want to show you, this is the cover of a journal, Italia Contemporanea, in which a few of these new researches were published recently. This was at the end of 2022. In contrast, histories of racism and colonialism have been growing in recent years, a response to the very limited attention paid to the phenomenon until the 1990s. And so here I covered a few of these books, but there's been really quite an important growth in their effort to demonstrate the important role of colonialism in Italian society and history, which is important, again, because of this neglect, right, of this not paying attention for so long to these themes, and their connection also with the building of Italian identity. So that such histories, as valuable as they are, tend to neglect the critical voices, thus giving what I think is a partial view of a more complex cultural and political world. So, and also risking of essentializing Europe and the West as if it were a homogeneous entity. So what I want to do today is to focus on the arguments deployed against colonialism in their relationship to the idea of racial hierarchy that was dominant in the late 19th and early 20th century, and also in their critique of that very notion. In the period that I focus on, the notion of race acquired a much greater relevance in the cultural and political debate. And it is in this period that the text dedicated to a full-fledged rejection of the primacy of race in arguments about history, society, in arguments about comparing different history and societies. In that context, these kind of full-fledged texts rejecting this idea appeared. So the questions I hope to address here are the following. To what extent was the anti-colonialism of the left, and I'll focus primarily on them, so, and by the left I'm here referring to Democrats, socialists, anarchists. To what extent was it based on anti-racist ideas and on a rejection of Eurocentrism? How did they question racial hierarchies and the idea of superior and inferior races? Did radicals understand colonialism as an intrinsically racist affair? How did the specificity of Italian history and society influence this oppositional discourse? Were radicals also able to extend their solidarity to the people who were subjected to colonialism? And how was this solidarity with the black and brown victims of colonialism expressed? So I will first look at two main components of this kind of anti-colonial discourse in its anti-racist version. One is the defense of what came to be known at the time as the right to barbarity. And the second one, so this was an issue of principle that spoke to reason. And the other thing that I'm looking for, the other component of this type of discourse, is the expression of what I call the sympathy for the barbarians. An issue of feelings that speaks to the heart. So, and I'm here sort of putting quotation marks around barbarians, barbarity, and so on. I'm using the language of that period. Then I will address the limitations of these anti-colonial and anti-racist discourses. And I will not address today, but maybe we can talk about it later, the links of this Italian anti-colonialism with other European anti-colonialism. So first of all, this question of the right to barbarity. Let me, first of all, recall a famous cry heard in the streets of several Italian cities after the news of the massive Italian defeat in Adua in March 1896 spread in the country. Long live Menelik. This cry, supporting the Emperor of Ethiopia, who had led the army against the Ethiopian army against the Italians, this cry accompanied the other cry, which was down with crispy the prime minister. And together they conveyed the popular rejection of war, of this colonial war, and of expansion, which prime minister had been pushing for years. Yeah, so he was a very strong pro-colonial politician at the time, before being a Garibaldino. So we'll see this connection also between this struggle for independence and this kind of rejection also. So that was a moment of maximum crisis for the colonial project, and it meant the end of the first Italian attempt to occupy Ethiopia. Italian colonialism was a contested affair and did not receive a unanimous approval, even from the economic and social elites of Italy at the time of what we call, Italian historians call the First African War, so from the 1880s to 1896. The benefits were not clear, and its costs were too high for a recently unified country that did not have many economic resources. So it is not surprising that many Italian radicals would strongly oppose colonialism when the Italian state in the mid-80s made its military move onto the coast of the Red Sea to establish a formal colony, and began to face the first setbacks with a major defeat in the Battle of Dogali. It's not far from Massawa. On the way, so this was on the way from the port of Massawa towards the interior. The almost 500 Italian soldiers who died in that battle are commemorated, as you imagine know, by the obelisk in Piazza dei Cinquecento, the piazza of the station, the main station in Rome. Now, the opposition to colonialism, which became even more vocal after that defeat, could be predicated on very different types of ideas and motivations. Some I would call principled, ideological, and others would be political and instrumental to the political struggle at the time. It is the former, so the ones that are more principled, that interest me, since it is on their basis that anti-racist arguments were developed. Among the strongest and most principled critics of colonialism were two radical Republicans, both Mazzinian. On the left, you see the geographer, Arcangelo Ghisleri, and to the right, the medical doctor and self-taught sociologist, Napoleone Colajanni, that I mentioned before. Colajanni was also a former Garibaldian volunteer. He was very close, he was a Republican, very close to the socialists. Now, the sensitivities of these men to the issues of colonialism was rooted in some specific aspects of 19th century Italy, namely its recent struggle for national independence, the Risorgimento, and also, in the case especially of Colajanni, in the issue of the place of the South in the new nation, so what is known as the Southern Question. The anticolonialism of Ghisleri, which is explained in a book published in 1888, containing a number of pieces first published in a journal that he had founded the previous year. This is a journal called Cuore and Critica, which is a wonderful title, in my opinion, which we could actually discuss later. Anyway, and then they were collected in a book, these articles, these pieces, so in which he explained why he opposed colonialism, because he wanted for African people the same rights demanded for European peoples, a position shared also by socialists, by anarchists, okay, by a variety of different groups on the left. What at the time was known as the extreme left, to distinguish them from another type of left that was represented by, let's say, the right-wing, Garibaldian, okay, so such as Crispi. So Italy had gained, in this view, Italy had gained its independence only recently. The principle of nationality, so had to be, again, if it was valid for Italian, had to be valid for anybody else, because otherwise Italians would not have any right to proclaim their nationality, and could be subjected to invasion by others too. Having just gained freedom, Italians had no right to deny to others. Either the right to nationality was universal or it didn't exist. Responding to a fellow Republican who had embraced colonialism in the name of the civilizing mission towards allegedly inferior races, Ghisleri rejected the idea that some races were absolutely superior and other inferior. All peoples participated in human progress and contributed to human civilization. He said also that the Caucasian race was just more arrogant than others, unable to recognize other civilization, and in many ways more cruel. Ghisleri reminded the detractors of blacks that the progenitors of all European peoples were once barbarians, and that their history showed that barbarism and civilization coexisted among the same people. Close to Ghisleri was also the previously mentioned Napoleone Colajanni, a Republican with a socialist orientation who rejected, let's say, started to be a strong opponent of Cesare Lombroso. He started by rejecting the biological determinism that he found in the text of Lombroso, especially Criminal Man. So that kind of determinism that Lombroso used to explain certain types of crimes. And Colajanni became this major voice in the debate on the Southern question, which he saw to a large extent as the result of a unification which had been led by the North and which had imposed a centralized centralized institutions in Italy that actually did not benefit the South. Even though he recognized, the existence of issues in the South, he rejected very strongly this kind of any kind of biological determinism explaining those. And in his 1891 book, which you see, the Politica Coloniale, he opposed, while opposing the colonial policy of the government, he criticized also the Eurocentric idea of civilization and the justification of European colonialism as a civilizing mission, recalling that many crimes committed in the history of European colonization and colonialism, in a very vivid fashion. Significantly, he called colonialism also a collective brigandage, using a term, brigandage, which the Italian state had deployed to stigmatize and criminalize the revolt in the South that followed the annexation of 1860. So there is clearly, some connection that he sees between what happened in the Italian South and colonialism overseas. In the context of colonialism, the real brigands for Colajanni were the Europeans, who stole the lands of other people, often massacring entire populations. As for the alleged superiority of some people and the inferiority of others, Colajanni pointed out that history shows that those who seem superior at a specific time are often inferior at another. So he relied a lot on sort of this kind of reading of the historical record of nations. The criticism of colonialism served him well a few years later when anthropologists such as Lombroso and his followers argued that the problems of the South were primarily the product of its racial makeup, which included elements of African origins. One of these Lombrosians, Alfredo Niceforo, called the Southerners the barbarians of Italy in this book of 1899. And then he wrote also another book, 1898, on Sicily, actually 1897, on Sardinia, which made a very strong, again, biological argument about an area of Sardinia in which there was a certain type of crime, and he connected that to the people, to their connection to Africa and to their African ancestry. So for Niceforo, the Southerners were stuck in an early stage of evolution and thus in need of civilization. In another book about Sardinia, right, he claimed again that it was all a matter of the African roots of its population. So Colajanni comes in, rejects this representation of the Southerners as racially other and barbarians, and he argued again for his social, historical, and socioeconomic causes of their situation. But he does more than that. In a pamphlet which he published in the same year, which is called Per la razza maledetta, if we go back in a moment, Per la razza maledetta, for the cursed race, he pushed the reasoning further, arguing that if Nicephore was right, if it was only a matter of race, there was nothing one could do. That population should be exterminated. The razza maledetta, these Sardinian people, was cursed, and I'm quoting, cursed to die like the inferior races of Africa, Australia, and so on, whom the ferocious and wicked civilizers of Europe systematically destroyed to get their land. So here there is also, right, clearly this parallel that is being made, and that allows him to appropriate the term razza maledetta to reject racism. The criticism of colonialism and of the racialization of the Southern questions were the basis for Colajanni's later work, in which he confuted the idea of pure races, and particularly the idea of the superiority of the Anglo-Saxons contrasted to the alleged inferiority of the Latins. You can see the book Latini e Anglo-Sassoni, right there, 1903. The immediate context for this book was a European debate taking place at the end of the century about the alleged decline of the Latin races vis-à-vis the rise of the Anglo-Saxon countries. According to some who claimed this decline, French, Italian, Spaniards were really sort of losing it in this kind of competition among European races. They seem to be constantly be on the losing side of wars. Also, they were less industrialized. And some contemporary observers came up with the idea that it was a matter of race. The well-disciplined and industrious Anglo-Saxon races were superior to the undisciplined and lazier Latin ones. So, as in his other works, Colajanni in this one showed the many contradictions of the ideas of these anthropologists and sociologists who were participating in this debate, contradictions in also the definition of races, the many conflict that existed among people who tried to define races. And he also showed again that peoples who are inferior at a certain time may be or superior at a certain time, they may be inferior at another. So many factors are responsible for the ups and downs of peoples and countries in history. Right, so these factors can be social, historical, political, and so on. So in Colajanni's vision of history, what he called the doctrines of races had no place. He rejected any correspondence between physical and mental or civil characteristics, and observed how Cesare Lombroso had himself fundamentally undermined his own theories when, in his book that confuted anti-Semitism, argued that the Jews were only the product of their environment and of the circumstances in which they had lived. So why is it that an argument for the Jews will not work for other groups of people? So, without denying, again, the influence of non-Italian authors on the thinking of Colajanni, and he cites many of them, I argue that Colajanni's antiracism grew out of the intersection of these various areas of critical and political engagement. But the crucial issue here is, and you may ask, did the critical stance on the notion of race extend also to Black Africans, right? Because he's talking a lot about European races, which he says, well, we're talking about nations, so there are a mix of races and so on. So what about Black Africans? In his book, he briefly discusses the situation of African Americans. noting how slavery had created their inferiority, and pointing out that there were now outstanding individuals such as Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, who were a testimony to their progress. Only the hatred of the whites was blocking that progress from going further. In his bibliography, he cites the works of Booker T. Washington and also of W.E.B. Du Bois, not yet The Souls of Black Folks, but other study that had been published. As for Black Africans, in the conclusions of Latins and Anglo-Saxon, he expressed his optimism with regard to their future, a future in which even blacks, he says, will enter into what he calls the great human family. So in other words, in the case of Africans, his anti-racism resembled a kind of paternalistic type of racism, okay? One that sort of sees the possibility for improvement, but fundamentally, is not able to sort of equate all groups, right? So it includes this kind of possibility for a racist to develop in the same way as the white Europeans. The so-called barbarians, in other words, had a right to barbarity, but their full humanity could only be imagined if they followed the path to development of white societies. Now, let me move to the other issue here, the sympathy for the barbarians, right? So the right to barbarity was not the only component of anti-racism. The anti-colonial opposition often pointed out that the overall greater poverty of the Italians vis-a-vis other European countries, their lack of education, generally their miserable life condition that made them closer to Africans than to European. Some commentators voiced, in this context, right, of argument against colonialism, voiced their sympathy for the barbarians, who defended their land against foreign aggressors, exactly like the Italians had defended theirs against the Austrians during the Risorgimento. After the Italian defeated Dogali in 1887, a democratic journalist stated that, I'm quoting, "My sentiment for the Abyssinians takes almost the character of brotherhood in the tragedy." Always in 1887, an anarchist even wrote an Abyssinian hymn. There it is. An Abyssinian hymn that was modeled after the Italian di Garibaldi, right? And in this kind of song, it's a poem actually, that was published in several newspapers. He has this line, okay, there is a refrain that says, "Get out of Africa, we are not brigands. Get out of Africa, get out foreigner." And this takes the model from the Inno di Garibaldi, "Get out of Italy, get out, it's a time, get out of Italy, get out foreigner." So there is a kind of, sort of identifications with the Abyssinians. It was published again in several newspapers, circulated, and in a journal, a socialist satirical journal of the time called L'Asino, was a satirical weekly. L'Asino is the donkey, of course, and it's the subtitle says "L'Asino è il popolo paziente, utile, paziente, bastonato." The donkey is the people, useful, patient, and beaten. So in this satirical weekly, you can read little pieces. This was one entitled on this issue of the war, one entitled "Barbarian Rulers," which was praising the Ethiopian Empress Taitu, who went to war herself, in contrast to the queens of Europe who stayed safe in their palaces. And we should place this in the context in which this empress, the Empress of Ethiopia, was represented as a particularly cruel and bloodthirsty ruler. So the barbarians had greater courage and sense of responsibility than those who believed to be the superior races. According to the socialist Leonida Bissolati, the effect of trampling on the rights of other people was a general moral regression, a kind of boomerang effect, right? And I'm quoting a line here, it meant getting used to disrespecting a black man who is a man like us, as Abyssinia is a people like Italy. So a different skin color could not change what is wrong into right and vice versa. Radicals could sympathize with the colonized also because they knew well how the European elites racialized the poor and the political rebels. For the former, the later were, for the elites, these categories of people were all barbarians. Governments harshly repressed their protests and revolts, similar to the way they repressed, in many ways, the colonized, even though they did not try to exterminate them. The Commune of Paris, in the context of the communists, of the repression of the communists, of the Commune of Paris, French anarchist geographer Élisée Reclus, who was actually quite an important influence on Ghisleri, that I mentioned before, another geographer, he noted how, and I'm quoting, brilliant officers accustomed to the massacre of Arabs and Kabyle came back to Paris to execute other savages. Late 19th century state treated internal subversive only slightly better, right, than the natives in the colonies at times, denying them many rights, executing them, and deporting them to the colonies. In fact, a couple of hundred Italian radicals were deported to the colonies. The Italian opposition to colonialism was not limited to the writing and speeches of these left-wing intellectuals and politicians, but was present also in grassroots organizations. After the defeat in Dogali, Workers' Association of Democratic, Republican, and Socialist orientation mobilized in northern and central Italy, and they opposed further colonial expansion, rejected the nationalist call for revenge to restore what was known as the honor of the country. In Milan, 46 workers' associations demanded an equal right for all without distinction of color. They questioned the ideas of honor and national interest articulated by the nationalists. Honor could not be restored with other killings. And the true national interest was not defended by colonial wars. Anarchist papers also questioned the exclusion of African soldiers who died in Dogali with Italians from the commemorations of the dead. The opposition became stronger after the defeat at Adua in 1896, when popular mobilization against colonial war reached its peak, right, and the cry that I mentioned at the beginning here, "Long live Menelik," was heard in many of the streets of Italian cities. Then the leftist anti-colonial opposition, finally united, also called for abandoning the Eritrean colony. The socialist Andrea Costa stressed that for the socialist, killing a black man is the same as killing a white, and the burning of the village in Africa was as evil as the burning of a village in Lombardy. Again, recalling the wars of the Risorgimento. The Italian socialists also expressed solidarity at that time for the anti-colonial resistance against the Spaniards in Cuba and the Philippines. Now, although the post-Adwa opposition was strong, and it included also Catholic, by the way, several conservatives, it was unable to undo the government policies. In fact, after a period of retrenchment, pro-colonial stances grew after 1900 among industrialists and bankers, and an aggressive right-wing nationalist movement emerged, eager to avenge the Adwa humiliation. After the turn of the century, some of the socialists even capitulated to colonialism in the name of providing an outlet for the millions of Italians who were migrating out of the country. So the most notorious of these pro-colonial socialist was the poet Giovanni Pascoli, who celebrated the Libyan occupation as a sign that the great proletarian, as he called Italy, had finally moved to acquire its place in the sun. The Italo-Turkish War of 1911-1912 saw a real orgy of self-congratulating nationalism that celebrated an occupation which seemed to efface the memory of Adwa. Although criticism of the Libyan occupation was voiced in different quarters, the socialists, consumed by their internal conflicts, were unprepared when Prime Minister Giolitti sent the troops to Tripolitania in October 1911. The general strike that the socialists organized at the end of September was not a success. Some radicals who appear to have been more, let's say, resistant to the lure of this kind of social imperialism were the anarchists. They were strongly anti-militarist, and for them the Libyan war, like all wars, was an expression of barbarism, in fact, the true barbarism, and totally misconceived. Among other things, they say, because I'm quoting from an article, in this journal, the Avvenire Anarchico, the Arabs were extremely jealous of their lands, of their women, and of their religion. During the first year of the war, Avvenire Anarchico, which was based in Tuscany, published letters also from soldiers who were hoping to come back from the slaughterhouse of war and be able to tell the public what it looked like. It felt like a sarcastic piece in this journal also attacked the rhetoric of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti about war as the hygiene of the world, and called Gabriele D'Annunzio a salesman of rhymes who had prostituted himself, I'm quoting, to our ferocious and avid rulers. The piece also criticized those who let themselves be killed in a war that brought benefits only for the bourgeoisie, not understanding, and I'm quoting, that the Italian civilized have the same worth as the Arab and Turk uncivilized. As the war continued, another article, always in this journal, addressed the mothers whose sons were to fight against other brothers who have, like all human creatures, mothers and sons who wait for their affection. So what did the civilization so much praised in the newspapers consist of? I'm quoting, perhaps the erection of the gallows in the square of Tripoli, and of the hanging of those who defended their native land. Do not talk of patriotic love when you exalt the destruction of other patria, other fatherlands. And this is always from Lasino, an illustration that shows, right, a gallows in the shape of a Christmas tree celebrating Christmas in Tripoli. So, for the anarchist, colonial wars were criminal wars, bound to leave behind, again here the theme of the boomerang effect, a sad, I'm quoting, a sad and painful atavistic legacy of hatred and desire for race revenge, which will be paid by our plebeian blood, end of quote. Collective moral regression was the price of this madness. Now, let me go back a moment before moving towards a conclusion to the issue of the socialists who caved in to colonialism. As a matter of fact, the Libyan war was not the first time some socialists had shown an accepting attitude towards colonialism. When the Eritrean colony was established in 1890, the socialist Antonio Labriola claimed that the colony could bring some advantages also to the Italian workers. If, for example, they were given some land to cultivate. In other words, he proposed a kind of socialist colonization, a kind of positive colonization. For socialists like Labriola, the improvement of the conditions of the national working class was more important than any principled cause. When colonialism was a fait accompli, the socialists should just try to make it benefit for workers. But there was also another reason, I think. The socialists who embraced colonialism shared a rigid, unilinear idea of evolution in which socialism represented the last stage of evolution. In this understanding, a society could not just jump stages, right? So primitive people needed to be civilized and transformed economically before they could achieve socialism. And the task was for the European to undertake. Those socialists who rejected this type of reasoning were also able to reject that kind of, again, simplistic evolutionist model, right? They thought that some European societies were actually more humane than some non-European societies were more humane than European societies, and they already had in themselves the seeds for transformation, and so they should be left alone to move in that direction. The disagreement on the matter of colonialism was present more generally in the Second International, established in 1889, where socialists were divided between the moderate reformists who espoused a paternalistic white supremacist position and justified colonialism, and the more radical socialists who rejected colonialism and thought non-European people should not be interfered with. So it's something that, again, was happening elsewhere. The anti-colonialists won in the Congress of 1907, and anti-colonialism became the position then of the Third International, which was established in 1919. The anti-colonial struggles of the colonized were becoming rapidly more visible to the Western observers at the turn of the century, and especially during and after World War I. In one of his writings, Antonio Gramsci referred to the struggles of the Muslim world against the European states, predicting a revolt of the colonies against the colonizer after the end of the war. Indeed, by 1920, anti-colonial movements were getting stronger in several colonized societies. And in fact, the Third International no longer gathered only Europeans, but included a sizable number of representatives from the colonies and the non-European countries. So now there is a famous song that you may be familiar with, La Lega, a song of the Italian female workforce in the rice fields of northern Italy, turn of the century. Some of its line said, and freedom does not come, and we workers, we want liberty, but freedom does not come because we're not united. Crumiri, col padrone, so scabs with the boss, the scabs are with the boss, and this is making it difficult for us to become a strong force. So the term crumiro, which is still used today in Italy, is strongly derogatory. It's a real insult. And it's, again, still employed to indicate those workers who do not join the strikers. In a very perceptive entry in one of the prison notebooks, Antonio Gramsci noted that the term crumiro came from the French when it referred to a Tunisian tribe whose alleged raids in the second half of the 19th century gave France the pretext to occupy Tunisia. In its usual perceptive way, Gramsci wondered how the term had entered the vocabulary of the Italian working class, a question that, as far as I know, still has not found an answer. But however it entered, it's clear that the term has a negative and stigmatizing function, reflecting the negative meaning associated with blackness in Italy. Similarly to the metaphorical use also of the term ascaro in the political language of that period, on which also Gramsci reflect, right? Ascaro was used in Italian to indicate deputies of very low rank who did not have an independent position. So, in other words, I'm sort of bringing up this because I want to sort of point out the culture of the working classes and their organization was clearly not exempt from the influence that colonialism exercised in the collective imaginary. But the working class movement, as we have seen, was also sensitive to the struggles of other oppressed people, like those in the colonies. Many democratic Republicans, socialists, and anarchists developed robust critiques of European civilization and of the so-called civilizing mission, and refused to deny to non-European people the self-determination that they had claimed for themselves when they too were a kind of colony of Austria. And as we have seen, they also rejected the idea of pure races and the idea of racial superiority and inferiority. Again, this does not mean, presenting them as, anti-racist champions. And I do not want to resuscitate the myth of the good Italian here. In fact, a proper history must point out also the limitation of this type of anti-racism. In the last chapter of Latins and Anglo-Saxons, Colajanni optimistically predicted that the large socialist movement, I'm quoting, will powerfully help, and is already helping, to rapidly increase international solidarity through the solidarity of interest which has united the working classes. Maybe this kind of solidarity, sort of planetary solidarity, is represented in this print that appeared on image that appeared on the frontispiece of the American edition of William Morris's News from Nowhere, where you can see the continent, the 5 continents around in solidarity, the solidarity of labor. Today we stand at a moment in history when this prediction seems completely denied by reality. Internationalism is under attack. The working classes of Europe and the US are embracing right-wing populist parties that peddle nationalism and anti-immigration recipe as a solution to their problems. And the leaders of the world superpowers assert blatant imperialist projects. An inclusive and transnational solidarity is certainly not easy to achieve. It demands, among other things, the pulling down of complex barriers, both material and mental, which dominate our societies and keep being reproduced more and more. And yet, in the past, the ideal expressed in the workers of the world unite, or workers of all colors unite slogan, that slogan did not seem so far-fetched. So if it was possible then, why should it not be possible again? Perhaps it's time to study more closely what made that solidarity, or the momentum solidarity, thinkable and possible in the past, to foster again some hope for the future in our very troubled world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I think we have now plenty of time for discussion, for questions and comments. I hope we'll jump in. We can also, take questions from the audience online. Right now. Please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Ernesto. I have 2 questions that are maybe related.
Yeah.
You mentioned this idea of paternalism that many of these intellectuals or politicians held, even if they were having good intentions, let's say, towards the colonized.
Yeah.
Do you think they are underlying these ideas, a previous idea of the bon sauvage that you can already find in Rousseau and other Enlightenment thinkers? And also connected to this, did any of these anarchists or left-wing politicians, intellectuals, rejected these views of history that affirmed like the fixed idea of evolution towards socialism, ever consider that maybe it was wrong to colonize and we should reject colonization because they didn't need anything from us, they didn't need any civilizing, like we were doing a favor to them or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question, right? Because of course you come up with the idea. So what was, they were not operating in a, let's say, in a milieu or intellectual, cultural, in which there were not previous, people also, other intellectuals in Europe who had been criticizing European civilization. The noble savage right, comes up right away. Absolutely, they clearly, some of them clearly know that literature, especially the Mazzinians, who are, right, Rousseau. So there is it's interesting how to see, right, in this literature, the emergence also of, for example, in the work of Reclus, of Élisée Reclus, the French anarchist geographer. He writes about primitive cultures, right, a book called Primitive Folks, in which there are portraits of various ethnic groups, some Native Americans, other from other regions of the world, in which the description of their costumes and their society, they're already sort of an interpretation of this society in a holistic fashion, which is that what cultural anthropologists of the 1920s, also French, sort of develop, right? So develop a criticism of races because they understand. And you can see some of it also among the Italians, right? So Ghisleri in particular is one who is sort of sensitive to this kind of discourse. And so they read many other texts. One can go back to even Montaigne, right? The cannibals, the essay on cannibals, which I would be curious to see whether it comes up. I haven't seen it yet. But yeah, absolutely. What is interesting here in this particular time is how then, of course, that type of ideas gets sort of reformulated and expanded, elaborated also in a context of this kind of emergence anthropological discourses. And so it's to contrast this kind of anthropologists like Lombroso and his followers, right? But also a kind of crude evolutionism, right? So that, yeah. So definitely there are people who say they don't need us, right? And these are the ones who are able to express a very strong, coherent and continuing anti-colonialism. Because the others, those who have this kind of idea that, society evolves through stages and that there's no way of jumping, as I was saying before, those are the ones who, have troubles with that. So you really have to sort of, to compare these people, you have to sort of see the kind of background that they have in approaching these issues, right? So it's interesting for that reason to see them, at work in elaborating these kind of ideas, the kind of ingredients, the kind of cultural ingredients that they use. And I was quite impressed to see, because again, I'm sort of coming, this is new for me to see what kind of, how they also read the Americans also, the Black Americans at the time, which is, again, something you don't think about. But they had read also, I mean, if I think about the debate, previously the debate on slavery in the US also, so they were reading also, of course, about that, the Civil War. So they've been elaborating on, ideas. But thanks for this question, because it comes immediately and you say, well, these are not the first people who are talking in these ways, but of course, the context is new, and there are, let's say, more sources to bring in.
Thank you. I wonder what is the position of the Roman Catholic Church in this situation? I mean, I think of Rerum Novarum, which is on the question of labor. And is it totally ignore questions of race?
No, they do not. Good question, too, because I said, I'm sure that would be this question. So, complex issue, right? The Catholic Church, because on the one hand, there is the proclamation we are all children of God. In practice, there are also sort of accepting lots of different institutions that show discrimination. The Church, on the other hand, wants also to expand the Word of God, so missionary work. So they're very much in favor of missionaries, right? Because you have to bring the truth to people all over the world. So there is a tension there. Because then, how do you defend the missionaries? At a certain point of the Church in those years, there is a strong Catholic anti-colonialism, which is very instrumental. The Church is in a battle against the liberal elites, the anti-clerical elites, so it's sort of criticizing very much the elites in power. So it's anti-colonial. Sometimes it expresses views that seem to be, you could say, anti-racist. For example, the exhibitions, the exhibitions of natives. There is one famous one in 1884, if I'm not mistaken, in Turin, in which Assabesi, a group of people from Assab on the Eritrea coast, are brought to Turin, and some Catholic journals at that time say, it's not a great idea, it doesn't look really good for, first of all, maybe these are not nobles from that region, but also they were being presented as, specimen of the sort of the local native aristocracy or something like that. So they criticize that, and they criticize also the spectacle, the idea of showing humans in that fashion. So you could say there is some kind of sensibility there. On the other hand, the Catholics really want to go there. And they think, they have an idea, you could say, if not biological racism, there is already a strong idea of a lower civilization that needs to be brought to the civilizing influence. Yeah, so I would say, I always see that their opposition at that time, although again, I've not read, I'm just starting with this work, I read anarchist and socialist journals, but from the secondary literature, what I could say is that when they criticize colonialism, it's primarily for political reasons. And then they, after the turn of the century, they really want to, they start to approach Catholics and let's say, the opposition to liberalism is not as strong because socialism becomes much more worrisome for the church. And so there is a bit of this rapprochement, and with Giolitti in Libya, it's very much at that point, they're very close to each other. But even in the second half of in the late 19th century, they are, they're very much in favor of the civilizing mission, the eradication of slavery, right? So they justify colonialism to a large extent, even though they criticize maybe the type of militaristic enterprise that colonialism requires. Okay, so let's have a sort of more peaceful type of colonialism. That would be the position that I could summarize, but it's a complex issue. Although I thought that, among people like these kind of radicals who had an ideology of equality, you could try to find there this kind of expression of also racial equality and rejection, sort of a rejection of racism. Equality, as I say, more elaborating, more sort of present in their ideology, as opposed to Catholicism.
Thank you, first of all. As you said, we've been working mostly on anarchist and socialist journals, of course. I wanted to ask you if...
And with this kind of democratic republicans,
Yes. And I wanted to ask you if you have happened to be working on literary works of the time, or if you plan to also address literary works.
Sorry, I missed it.
Sorry, no. If you have been working also on literature, or if you plan to, you've been quoting Pascoli, of course. La Grande Proletaria is a speech, but if you...
Yeah, some works of fiction. Excellent question. And I'm thinking, I could not come up. I mean, there is someone, maybe you can tell me something about this novel. There's a little short novel story by Pirandello, which is called Zafferanetta, which sort of interests me. It's a story in which he sort of is imagining this guy who had been, this Italian who went to the Congo under the Belgian Congo. Okay, so this was written, I think, in 1912 or so. He's imagining he's coming back, and he's bringing back a child that he had with a local woman. And this child doesn't do very well in Italy. It's surrounded by contempt, by all sorts of, represented as a little monkey. It sort of represents this kind of very sort of narrow-minded, milieu in which this little kid ends up, and she sort of becomes very sick and so on. And he's the father is sort of torn. You know, he's got married to an Italian woman. Of course, he left the mother of the child back in the Congo. And then at a certain point, he cannot face this kind of, you know, the unhappiness of the child, and they decide they will go back. They will both go back to Africa. And it's a kind of strange story because it shows, on the one hand, okay, so one would say they leave, they're no longer sort of being a problem in this society. So this kind of so unique couple of father and mixed race child, they go, but there is also this kind of love of the father for the child, and this description of this kind of you know, strong racism in the population that's surrounding this kind of, so I don't know what to do with that. But I was just telling you, it's a story that right, brings that issue. But I was thinking about all this huge colonial literature. That there is the colonial novel, right? Some of these colonial novels seem to be problematizing a bit that, right? I mean, they're not all sort of pro-colonial. I mean, most of them are very pro-colonial propaganda and so on. But others are written by women, some written by women, I think, right? That are sort of more complex.
Yeah, just to follow up, did they ever read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, for example, around that time? Would that be available to them in Italian?
Something at the time, yeah, I think it was probably available. I'm trying to think, when was it translated? Yeah. But I was thinking, in terms of the question here is, do we see some novels, right, you were saying?
Yeah.
Featuring that. Right, that would be that's a wonderful novel, of course, to sort of keep in mind whether you guys who study literature probably know more about this than me, but yeah, that would be a way to go, right? See how that comes in, how it is read, because of course it's also problematic. There are problematic aspects in it, but yeah, it would be interesting to see. But I was thinking about other Italian
in Charles
writers.
We've been discussed a short story by Enrico Boito, L'Alfier Nero. I guess it was written in 1867. There's a representation of a black man that is, I think it's pretty unique for the time.
Right. That could be, yeah. That was 1867,
I believe
right?
So,
yeah. It would be interesting to bring that to, absolutely, to make it. And I was interested in this kind of songs and other things. I mean, right, other material that one could bring in. And also, of course, you know, if one goes back, I mean, there is that book by Axel Korner about the relationship between the 19th century reception in Italy of what was taking place in the US. Right, so there is a chapter on also the translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin and all that kind of debate on slavery, so one could bring in. So, I mean, although I wonder whether at that point there is really some kind of, let's say, articulation of a rejection of the notion of race, right? Because that was what interested me here was getting into that kind of discussion, right? As opposed to more largely, or let's say, having that as a particular focus to keep this thing together. Yeah.
You mentioned the Jews in connection with Lombroso. I was wondering, I'm curious how they play into this also in light of subsequent developments.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how exactly to bring it in. Because clearly Lombroso helps in this story. Because Lombroso on the one hand is very anti-black, right? He really considers sort of black inferior. So in that book of 1871, L'uomo bianco, l'uomo di colore, this very sort of, but again, when he actually comes up with the question of the Jews, are the Jews a race? And you know, and there is all this anti-Semitism, right? How does he react to that? And he reacts by saying that they are, in fact, just shaped by other things, that race has nothing to do with them, really. That there are people who has been shaped by, and so it comes in criticizing, but then it's not able to go beyond. But anti-Semitism, however, the presence of anti-Semitism then, certainly it existed, right? It was there. The Catholic Church was actually quite active in spreading that type of, think about Civiltà Cattolica. How did the socialists react to that type of anti-Semitism? Ambiguous. I think it's more ambiguous there, right? Because there is a current within 19th century socialism, especially in France, but also a bit in Italy, in which stereotypes, anti-Semitic stereotypes are present. I mean, the connection with finance, right, with the economic system. So it's there. On the other hand, there is also rejection. So I would say maybe it comes in because I guess that my approach here is anti-racism over time, but especially anti-black racism. But I should bring that too in some ways on how it operates. Two big histories, I would say. I guess that one has to focus maybe on one without forgetting that there may be an interaction at a certain point. But not so much then. I think that the interaction, I think that the reflection on the connection between anti-black racism and anti-Semitism will become important after 45, right? I mean, when some people think, I mean, if I think about Césaire, I mean, black intellectuals, I think Du Bois again thinks about how can we bring together these two different races because they have connections. Right, Sartre also sort of thinks about that. But it would be sort of interesting to see the elaboration by others besides Lombroso. Again, I do not know, but it would be interesting to bring them, or maybe important to bring them together. If someone can come up with that. Not sure they do. I have to, consider that question. It's a good question.
So, I think you raised your hand. Okay, so thank you for sharing all that knowledge with us. Thinking on how do you see potentially similar attitudes from the left in contemporary society in Italy when it comes to present-day racism? Especially in the context of the Mediterranean refugee crisis, is something that's kind of very happening right now. And so, like, how do you see this body of work informing or help inform the rabbit holes and nuances that the left right now might deal with when approaching anti-racism that might maybe not come from an anti-colonial standpoint, but maybe a more decolonial standpoint, so to speak?
Yeah, so the contemporary positions, it's sort of a bit divided because there is a lot of, today, I mean, there is a lot. Some people sort of, if you have followed a bit recent debate on these issues, that they would like to eliminate the word race from the Constitution, right? This is a kind of, I would say, that a colleague of mine calls scientific anti-racism. They say because the term race, doesn't refer to anything that exists in nature, we should just eliminate it because it reifies something that doesn't exist. Right. So I would say one position is that, but other people. At this point there is also an important anti-racist movement among non-white Italians. Right, and those criticize the fact that there is a certain type of anti-racism that doesn't really speak to people, who have different experiences, different backgrounds, and so they even think that there is a certain type of anti-racism that is somehow colonial still, right? And so there is this kind of decolonial movement. It's not very big. I don't think it's as big as there is in France, for example, today. Among what is called the movement in Les Indigènes de la République, There's nothing of that kind. I mean, it's a very different context. But I would say, yeah, I think that in Italy I see the prevalence still of this kind of universalist type of antiracism, right? Let's not, and also the strategies interculture, you know, try to end discrimination, change the citizenship law, which is so full of blood, of jus sanguinis, and all that. So I would say division. What is interesting in Italy, maybe a bit problematic, is that there's not like a movement, you know, centralized movement, a big organization of that kind. It's all the initiative at very local level. And then sometimes the parties of the left pick up, you know, the idea of reforming the citizenship law, but so far they failed completely. Yeah, so a rather depressing, in that respect, a rather depressing picture.
So,
yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a question that concerns the relationship between anti-capitalism and anti-racism. So I was wondering if you could expand on the term colonial. And so from my understanding, it enters the use in French as a racial slur, and then it is adopted in the jargon concerning strikes and scabs specifically. So in that context, in the context of socialists and anarchists, was it still perceived as racially charged, or was it just depenalized of this?
So the question would be the relationship between these kind of discourses and also an understanding of capitalism as a motor. Yeah, but in terms of at a certain point, right, the economic, it's something that, right, that favors colonialism, favors the bourgeoisie, is done for economic reasons, you know, or for reasons that, you know, are diverse. Yeah, it's the type of strong connection that we see with Lenin. I think you have to wait a bit. And also I don't see, for example, if we think about Gramsci, Gramsci doesn't go too much into that. I mean, he talks a bit, but there is not much reflection on these issues by Gramsci, right, in the prison notebooks. Not much. I mean, there are sort of some small, yeah, places, sort of short observations. So, you know, and Lenin himself, I would say that this is a bit what Lenin, how Lenin shaped also the thinking about colonialism, even among historians, that for some time they were not paying attention to it, also because Italian imperialism was seen as l'imperialismo straccione. Right, it was not very important. Did not have a strong economic basis. It was more, you know, more done for political reasons, a reason of prestige, of national prestige, and not. So this kind of reflection I don't see very much there. Did I address your question?
Yes, and then like specifically to the term Kumiro, because I understand that it was racially charged, racial slur, Kumiro. And then it's used also in the context, in the jargon of strikes and so on and so forth. So in that context, used by an anarchist, for example, was it still racially charged, or was it just a term to define scabs?
The word that you're using, racial?
A racial slur, an insult.
At that time, no, it was sort of used. I mean, all these people, let's say, they all use this language, right? So more or less, they, you know, they may criticize the notion of pure races, and they may criticize also the division of the world into races. They still use this language, though. I mean, it's not, yeah, I would say, at that time, sort of, that may be an issue, a more recent issue.
We have a question from Luca Abautista of Columbia University online. And he said, I would be interested to learn more about what might be called internal racism within the context of the Southern question, as it developed later during fascism, and how it intertwined with the concept of an Italian race after 1938.
So it's so the question is exactly. It's I missed something in your.
So he's asking if you could expand more about internal racism, la cuestione meridionale.
Anti-Southern.
Yes, particularly as it develops later during fascism, and how it intertwined with the concept of an Italian race after 1938 and the racial laws.
Yeah, anti-Southern racism during fascism. Yeah, well, the question is that so the Southern question during fascism is thrown out, right? It doesn't exist because fascism tries to unite all the Italians and pretend that the Southern question doesn't exist. So someone argues also, the book is by Giuliani and Lombardi upon the history of the racial identity of the Italians. They argue that, in fact, in that period, fascism tried to unify the Italians by, creating this kind of imperial consciousness and contrasting very sharply, right, the Italians and the people in the colonies, right, with the empire. So that Southern question is really not discussed at all in that period, but there is this kind of attempt to unify the Italians through a contrast with the colonized, which is much sort of stronger than in the previous period, in the period that I'm sort of examining. So why the question after 38? So after the racial laws?
I believe so. He just says after 1938.
Yeah, because right, with the racial laws, right, there is right, the attempt, of course, and with the manifesto on race, right, there is this kind of distancing from the interaction of Aryanism and the distancing from the idea of the Mediterranean race that had emerged before, right? So fascism needs to make sure that there is no confusion about the racial identity of the Italians. So that's I mean, the manifesto exactly is expressing that. It doesn't last too long, and it's sort of something that is almost immediately sort of contested by other anthropologists who had the different ideas of how you construct the Italian race. So I mean, the discussion. So it was sort of an imposition from above, right, of something that, however, found still a number of different ideas there, but with, of course, horrible consequences for the minority that was racialized and discriminated and persecuted so harshly at that point. Yeah.
We're beginning to trespass on your time, so I feel bad asking one final question. But maybe I'll ask a concluding question about your conclusion.
Yeah.
And I was very struck with the idea of sort of a return now to this archive of anti-racism, right? So we have a past, you're saying, that maybe has some relevance in the present moment. And it made me wonder whether there were previous returns to this discourse. So with Ghislandi and Colajanni, we discussed today, did their work get picked up on in the 60s and 70s in an earlier moment of anti-colonialism?
It's a good question. Yeah, because it's a question I was asking myself. This memory of Colajanni is a bit problematic, and one wonders why. Probably because Colajanni himself, something I didn't tell you, but Colajanni himself started to be a bit in trouble around the Libyan war. Okay, so once the thing was, once Libya had been occupied, and there was a vote in parliament on some aspect of that story, I'm trying to remember closely, but better. But anyway, he voted with the government. And then there is the rise of, and then also he was a strong defender of Sicilians during the fascist Siciliani. But then he had a moment again there too, in which he was also close to Crispi. There was some ambiguity with him. So he's not the perfect champion of, of this cause, let's say. And also with fascism, the rise of fascism. Some ambiguity again there. So again, so it's someone who could not be, let's say, really recovered fully and made into, the very good anti-racist for other causes. So somehow sort of gutted it out, but in more recently, there's some kind of a bit of a reevaluation. Okay, again, because you have to place it in that period and see what it was able to contribute vis-a-vis the type of debate and discussion that existed at the time. He's been again, also was in favor of protectionism. There were other southern meridionalists who were very strongly opposed to protectionism when it was introduced in the 1870s. They thought that it was terrible for the South, that it was killing the good sort of very viable new productions in the South, in agriculture and so on. So it's it's been picked up by, if you know this book on Lombroso and the Museum of Lombroso in Turin, right? The woman who has written this book is Milicia, right? She's an anthropologist who said, well, there was something to Colajanni that we should forget all the way in which it has been, sort of marginalized before and picked him up again. And I think I agree with her in this kind of debate. I mean, again, it's the text, one of these texts, and also the Per la razza maledetta and the cursed race, the book for the cursed race, and the book on Latins and Anglo-Saxon is full of interesting material. So I think it's actually, the time in which we could actually, pick him up again after a period in which it was forgotten. So, yeah, and it goes like this, right? History is often, a series of discontinuities, and then at a certain point when it becomes again important to discuss the certain matters, you rediscover there's certain things that have been forgotten. And I think that right now, the way I see working on anti-racism is also a way for me to sort of understand better certain issues being discussed today, I think. Because again, there is a lot, at this point, there is a lot of sort of knowledge, at least in the academic community, about the working of colonialism at a cultural level. But there is much less debate or knowledge produced by academics also on the meaning of anti-racism. That is also, I mean, we see right now, I mean, we are in a moment in which it's being contested. And why? Why so? And in Italy too, I mean, there is lots of people who say it's better not to talk about it. But why? Shouldn't we actually talk more? It's very divided, and so I thought that probably writing about the elaboration of these ideas, or reminding ourselves that there were people who were sort of strongly, opposed also to colonialism now that it comes back, maybe it's a good idea. I don't know. I mean, for whatever, your scholarship does in the world, that admittedly is not much.
So, that seems like a place to conclude. So please join me in thanking our I have no doubt the conversation will now continue.
Thanks so much.